Good evening, friends. It is indeed my great pleasure that I am now giving another video talk on the thematic subject matter foreign policy, idea and perception of foreign policy. What one means or understands by the word foreign policy. What is the idea behind it? Generally, it is understood as one country's relations with other countries by way of a policy encompassing the concepts such as trade, economic interest, national interest, peace, security, and also efforts to keep good neighborly relations. This is what we understand when we call and understands by way of when one expresses the term foreign policy. Now, it foreign policy of any country for that matter, if we see that from ancient times also, it generally emanates from its domestic ideological political framework. In the present scenario, we have countries which are considered as democratic, liberal, communist, formally monarchical political structure, and ideological political structure, theology, and for example, in the Middle East, etc. We have a military domination also in different parts of the world. Now, these political structure in different political nationalities or nation states, they primarily they plan out or affect the foreign policy of that particular country. For example, we can say, for example, we have India as a democratic country, we have a USA, we have a UK. Uh, Therefore, we believe in the liberal democratic framework of our foreign policy. Now, as regard to China is concerned, it is basically a communist ideologically based country. Obviously, its foreign policy will be governed by that political framework or ideology. We have Israel, another state which is based on Zionism. In Europe, we find different shades and variations of democracy. And similarly, we find that different kind of democratic systems or military combinations come liberal frameworks we can find out in different parts of South Asia, African countries. Now, after giving this little background, let us understand the concept of foreign policy. The concept of foreign policy, though it suggests like a modern construct, yet it has a deep links way back to ancient times, whereof states and empires were engaged in varied interactions to secure power, resources, and stability through evolved foreign policy based on aggressive statecraft to a structured practice shaped by diplomacy, trade, and international cooperation. Further, let us see specifically how the foreign policy it evolved during the ancient times. Generally, we see that in ancient times, or in the ancient world for that matter, foreign policy was often an issue of military power and alliances for survival. Civilizations such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China had complex structured relationships with its neighbors based on mutual interest or dominance. It is pertinent to state that treaties and alliances, for example, in Egypt, diplomatic marriage treaties or the peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittites are quite a few of the earliest examples of structured foreign policy. Now, here the one question is arises: what was the Egyptian Hittites peace treaty, the earliest we have in ancient history? The treaty proclaimed that both sides would forever remain at peace and bound and bear, protect the children and the grandchildren of the people or parties. They would not commit acts of aggression against each other. They would repatriate each other's political refugees and criminals and in suppressing rebellion. Now, this was the basic earliest treaty uh, gist of it. Let us see what was the position in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, alliances and enmities among city states, for example, the Delian League, were strategic and at times warfare was seen as a policy tool. Most importantly, it is a very relevant fact that deserves genuine mention herewith that Thucydides, a Greek historian, highlighted ideas around dynamics, highlighted ideas around power dynamics and security, and these concepts still underpin modern international relations. In ancient India, we find a basic treatise, a work of Kautilya's Arthashastra. It highlighted early theory of foreign policy, advocating and emphasizing for a strategic and realistic approach to diplomacy, alliance building, and warfare. In China, we find the warring states period. They developed Sun Tzu's art of war, highlighting strategy, relations, and significance of diplomacy. Further, we find in China the Confucius or Confucian ideas of harmonious relations genuinely developed Chinese diplomatic philosophy. Now, if we come now, let us see what was the position of foreign policy idea and its perception during the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe and the Islamic world, we see foreign policy to be influenced by religions and ideological imperatives. The Byzantine Empire, it evolved diplomatic efforts combining military power with alliances and marriages, while the Islamic caliphates expanded diplomatically, establishing trade routes that interconnected diverse parts of the world. The Crusades were a demonstration of a foreign policy where it intervened with religious motivations. In Mughal Empire under Genghis Khan showcased an early form of a centralized foreign policy that combined military conquest with religious tolerance and economic integration. Another important fact worth to be mentioned is about Japan. In medieval Japan, alliances and isolationist policies were common, foreshadowing a longer tradition of controlled foreign influence. Now, during the early modern period, say between 15th to 18th centuries, the emergence and evolution of the nation state system in Europe, after particularly the Treaty of Westphalia 1648, structured formally foreign policy into a more systematic practice. Afterwards, we find that diplomacy became professionalized and European states got engaged in a complex network of alliances exemplified by the balance of power diplomacy to prevent any one state from dominating the other. And the four basic principles under this system was the early treaty, national self-determination, precedent for ending wars through diplomatic congresses, peaceful coexistence among sovereign states as the one and maintained by the balance of power among sovereign states and acceptance of principle of non-interference in the military affairs of other sovereign states. Now, this was the basic structure of the foreign policy. After this, what we call as this the Treaty of Westphalia 1648. Colonialism, the evolution of colonialism. It is important that the European foreign policy during this period of colonialism, with the states pursuing expansionist policies that prioritized overseas territories and, importantly, the foreign policy was influenced by mercantile commercial interests and shaped by the competition for wealth and resources abroad. The colonial expansion of Spain, Portugal, Britain, and France had profound impact on global trade and diplomacy. Now, during 19th century, we find ideologies and balance of power. In the 19th century, foreign policy idea and perception was influenced by the concepts of nationalism and imperialism. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 sought to establish a balance of power in Europe and prevent the rise of a single dominant state. The important political development during the 19th century was diplomats like Austria's Metternich that crafted foreign policies focused on statically, strategically, and preventing revolutionary movements. However, interestingly, the rise of nationalist movements encouraged independence movements. At the same time, imperialist expansionism was also at their peak, with European powers particularly participating in the areas Africa and other regions, and justified by ideologies like the civilizing mission. They call it the civilizing mission. Now, let's come to the 20th century, world wars and international isolationism. The rise of nationalism led to devastating consequences due to unchecked nationalism and militarism that led to World War I. Consequently, the League of Nations was founded or formed as an attempt at collective security and world peace, though it ended in fiasco. After World War II, the United Nations was established, institutionalizing a, a new phase of foreign policy, highlighting the areas on cooperation, collective security, and the prevention of global conflicts. During 1950s onwards, Cold War introduced a bipolar world order with the US and Soviet Union developing opposing foreign policy doctrines, containment and the Brezhnev Doctrine. During this era, proliferation of alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact developed and were established. From 1960s onwards, decolonization process due to political nationalist factors reshaped foreign policy across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, with the new national independent states pursuing non alignment or joining ideological blocs. Now, let us see the foreign policy specifically during the modern era, where we call it as globalization and the new challenges. Important feature in the post Cold War era, foreign policy became more focused on economic cooperation and globalization. The European Union exemplified integration and collective foreign policy, which global organizations like the World Trade Organization regulated trade relations. At present, foreign policy is deeply involved with the challenges like terrorism, climate change, cybersecurity, and economic interdependence. Importantly, another feature is at present is multilateral diplomacy. Through the United Nations, the Paris Agreement on climate change, and G20 summits illustrates a commitment to collaborative problem solving exercise. However, there are also rising populationist and nationalist movements, with some countries emphasizing sovereignty and strategic autonomy. The, in nutshell, it may be said that perception of foreign policy over time, throughout history, we find foreign policy has been perceived as a balance between national interests and the pursuit of international stability. In ancient times, it was synonymous with survival and dominance, while in the modern era, it has seen as a tool for promoting global stability, economic growth, and mutual security. Public opinion increasingly influences foreign policy, especially in democratic states, as people expect politics that reflect both national and global welfare. At the end, it may be stated that the perception of foreign policies continues to shift as global connectivity makes international relations even more interdependent and nuanced. Now, generally, at present in the world, whether it is Asian countries or Africa or European countries, there are general factors which are affecting whether it is a developed country or if it is a developing countries or whether it is a underdeveloped countries. The overruling ideas and features. First is development of science and technology has made the nations across ideological nuances or geographical specifics or geographical locations interdependent. The present world is a digital world where the information flow is instant. Then international organizations like United Nations, European Union, ASEAN, NAM, G20 summits, etc., etc. Though there is a honest attempt by the countries involved to have cooperation and world peace, however, their specific national interests also come in the way, and therefore, the developed countries or the capitalist countries or the rich countries for that matter, they play a much more dominant role in formulating their foreign policies vis-a-vis the other countries, and at the same time, the developing countries or the underdeveloped countries' foreign policy is also influenced by the policies that the capitalist or the rich countries or the developed countries they have formulated. Another very important factors that, as I have said initially, that the basics or the basic factor of a foreign policy of a state is the reflection of the domestic policy of a state, meaning thereby is that whatever is the political ideology, economic growth of a particular state is, accordingly, the foreign policy of that state is impacted accordingly. And therefore, the domestic problems, they also, for example, there are certain many countries in Middle East or in Africa or in West Asia and South Asia like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, etc. We have the local issues, I mean the domestic issues of terrorism or what we call it as uh, separate nationalist ideology. Now, that affects or the states where the military is more powerful, like Pakistan, because in Pakistan, we though we have a so-called constitution and elections, though they do take place, but there the military plays a very important role, and therefore the policy, foreign policy of of Pakistan, is basically impacted or influenced by the military rulers. Similarly, in Middle East, where we have a formal monarchical structure, but there also the princely states, for example, the princes or the rulers, they play important role in formulating their foreign policy. Terrorism is a worldwide phenomenon, whether it is Europe, whether it is Asia, whether it is Africa. Terrorist groups of different shades and different ideological groups where they do have a particular local interest, but they sometimes they have a regional interest, and at some time they have an interest at the world level. Now they play a very very important role, and they influence the foreign policy of the states. Now, after stating all this thing, presently there are two great things that are happening. Iran uh, war with Israel and Ukraine's war with Russia. Now, these are the two major political episodes, or we may call it happenings, which are taking place where the war is going on for a very, very long period, and that has affected the economic and the political policies of all the countries of the world, for that matter. Therefore, in the end, it may be said that foreign idea of a foreign policy has been there from the ancient times, and it got evolved, a perception changed as per the socio-economic political evolution, development, structure taking place. And primarily now, where the world has become interdependent, digital world, science and technology is really calling the shots. And therefore, has become a very complex subject matter, and it is expected that for the world peace and world order to be in a proper way is established and continue, it is necessary that all the states, they should have their foreign policy with the basic objective to have world peace and order. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much.